The ship has not even left the African coast, and already the system is visible in full. Men with ledgers on the shore, guards at the fort, captives marched in from the interior, the sea waiting beyond the walls like a machine already in motion. And the horror of it is that this is not chaos, not a sudden outbreak of cruelty, but a chain being built, link by link, until it can move millions. Stay with this story, because by the end, you will see how African lives were turned into one of the most profitable engines in world history, and how empires did not simply profit from that system, but rose on it. Long before Europeans arrived in large numbers on the West African coast, African societies were already part of complex trading worlds of their own, moving gold, ivory, salt, textiles, and goods through regional and trans-Saharan networks that had existed for centuries. And that matters, because the story does not begin with a blank map waiting for Europe to animate it. It begins with a connected world that is about to be redirected. In the 15th century, Portuguese ships began pushing down the coast of West Africa in search of wealth, access, and routes that could break older commercial monopolies. And at first, what they found was not a ready-made slave empire, but a coastline of kingdoms, merchants, ports, and political systems already negotiating power on their own terms. Yet contact changed the scale of possibility. European merchants did not just bring ships, they brought a new kind of demand, one tied to Atlantic plantations that were beginning to expand on islands and in the Americas, where sugar in particular was becoming so profitable that labor itself started to be treated as the central problem to solve. That is the term that matters, because once demand for labor rose across the Atlantic, trade on the African coast stopped being only about precious goods and increasingly became about people. Forts appeared not as monuments to exploration, but as storage points, bargaining posts, and fixed instruments in a larger network. And over time, the relationship between coast and interior began to change under the pressure of this demand. European traders rarely moved deep inland themselves. They operated from the shore, relying on intermediaries, alliances, rivalries, warfare, and existing political fractures to draw captives toward the coast. And that is how a trade contact becomes a system. Not all at once, not cleanly, not with one decision, but gradually, as a labor demand in the Atlantic world grows strong enough to pull violence, profit, and human movement into a new alignment. What had once been one set of commercial routes became entangled with another, and the consequences would spread far beyond the ports where ships first dropped anchor, because from that moment forward, the value of a human life could be recalculated thousands of miles away by the needs of a plantation, the appetite of a market, or the ambitions of an empire. Once that demand takes hold, it does not stay at the shoreline. It begins to reach inward, pulling on existing tensions, reshaping conflicts, turning distance into part of the system itself, and what follows is not random violence, but a pattern that repeats so often it becomes structure. Because now the supply has to match the scale of the demand, and that means people must be found, taken, and moved in ways that can be sustained over time, not just once, but again and again. Inland, the pressure builds slowly at first, and then with increasing force, as wars, raids, and political rivalries become tied to the possibility of trade with the coast, and captives who might once have been absorbed into local systems are now redirected towards something else entirely, marched over long distances in chains or under guard, moving through territories that begin to feel the weight of this new reality, where human beings are no longer just part of local conflict, but part of a wider economy waiting beyond the horizon. By the time they reach the coast, they enter spaces designed for holding, sorting, and transferring them efficiently. Forts that face the ocean, but are built around control, with dark, enclosed rooms below and open yards above, places where people are counted, grouped, inspected, and prepared not for life, but for sale. And the system reveals itself clearly in the details, because nothing here is accidental. Everything is arranged to keep movement flowing from inland capture to ocean departure. Traders keep records, numbers are written down, categories emerge, patterns stabilize, and what begins as a series of individual transactions starts to behave like a continuous operation where ships arrive on schedules, captives are accumulated in anticipation, and the entire process becomes predictable enough to expand. Over time, millions are drawn into this chain, not in isolated bursts, but through a sustained process that reshapes entire regions, because the loss is not only measured in numbers removed, but in the instability created around that removal. Communities disrupted, power balances shifted, and the constant presence of external demand altering decisions far from the coast. And that is the point where the system becomes difficult to break, because it no longer depends on one place or one group. It is distributed, connected, reinforced at multiple levels, feeding forward into the next stage, because across the ocean, plantations are growing, profits are rising, and the demand that started this process is now stronger than ever, waiting for the next shipment to arrive. And when those ships finally pull away from the coast, the system does not pause, it tightens, because everything up to this point has been preparation for the crossing itself, where distance is no longer a barrier, but a function, something to be calculated, managed, and turned into profit. And what unfolds in the open Atlantic is not disorder, but a kind of brutal precision that reveals how far this system has already evolved, because ships are not just carrying people. They are carrying numbers, expectations, margins. Below deck, space is measured carefully, bodies arranged in rows so tight that movement becomes almost impossible. Chains linking individuals together, air thick and stagnant as days and nights blur into one continuous stretch of endurance, and above them, the crew moves with routine familiarity, because for them this is not an exception, but a pattern repeated voyage after voyage, one where loss is anticipated and accounted for rather than feared. The middle passage becomes the central artery of the entire system. Moving, like more than 12 million Africans across the ocean over centuries, and even the suffering inside those ships is absorbed into the logic of the trade, because mortality rates, often reaching 10 to 20% on individual voyages, are not treated as failure, but as variables within a calculation that still produces profit if enough survive to be sold. Disease spreads quickly in confined spaces. Dehydration and malnutrition weaken bodies already pushed to their limits. And yet, even here resistance appears, in revolts that erupt when opportunity allows, in refusals to eat, in acts of defiance that remind us that the system, no matter how controlled, never fully erases human will. It only suppresses it. Still, the ships continue, crossing weeks of open water toward ports where the next stage is already waiting. Because the journey is not the end of anything, it is a transition. A movement from one form of control into another, and by the time land comes into view, the system has already stripped away names, languages, and connections, preparing those who survive to be received not as people arriving, but as cargo delivered into a structure designed to convert them immediately into something else. The moment the ships anchor, the pace of the system accelerates again, because arrival does not bring relief, it triggers conversion, and what happens on land is where the logic of the entire structure becomes unmistakably clear. Because this is the point where a human life is formally turned into property in the eyes of the law, the markets, and the people who profit from it. And the transition happens quickly, almost mechanically, as groups are brought off, the ships weakened, disoriented, often unable to communicate, and placed into holding areas where buyers begin to assess them not as individuals, but as potential output. Hands checking muscle, eyes inspecting teeth, bodies examined for signs of illness, age estimated, strength measured, everything translated into value in a process that reduces identity into price. Auctions follow, sometimes public and crowded, sometimes private and negotiated, but always structured around the same principle that a person can be exchanged, documented and owned, bills of sale written, transactions recorded, ownership transferred with the same legal clarity used for land or livestock. And from that moment forward, the transformation is not temporary. It is permanent because colonial laws across the Americas have already defined enslaved people as chattel property that can be bought, sold, inherited, mortgaged, and divided, protected not by morality, but by courts and governments that enforce ownership as a right. But the most important shift is not just that people become property, it is that the system learns to extend itself forward. Because under the legal doctrine that governs these societies, the status of the mother determines the status of the child, meaning every birth automatically expands the system from within, removing the need for constant external supply and turning reproduction itself into part of the economic structure. And that is the moment where the system becomes self-sustaining, where it no longer relies solely on ships crossing the ocean, but begins to grow through generations, embedding itself deeper into society, with every child born into it. Plantation records begin to reflect this transformation with unsettling clarity, listing individuals alongside assets, tracking age, health, and productivity, recording births not as personal events, but as increases in value, and the language of accounting absorbs human life completely until existence itself becomes measurable in financial terms. And by now, the chain is complete enough to do what it was designed to do. Because once people have been converted into property, the system can begin extracting something far more powerful than labor alone. It can begin generating wealth. Once that conversion is complete, the system no longer needs to justify itself, it simply begins to extract. Because now every hour of labor can be measured, every field can be calculated, and every body can be pushed toward output in a way that turns suffering into something the market can absorb. And this is where the scale becomes undeniable, because what is built across the Americas is not scattered plantations, but entire production zones designed around one purpose: to generate commodities at volumes high enough to reshape economies thousands of miles away. In the Caribbean, sugar plantations operate with relentless intensity. Fields cut and processed in cycles that leave little room for rest. Mills running constantly to convert cane into a product that becomes one of the most valuable commodities in Europe, while in North America, tobacco spreads first and then cotton rises, expanding across vast territories in the South as global demand increases, each plant tied to systems of labor that require precision, discipline, and force to maintain output. And across all of these regions, the same pattern repeats: labor extracted under conditions that maximize production regardless of human cost. The work is organized, timed, enforced, not chaotic but structured, because efficiency drives everything, and that efficiency translates directly into profit. Shipments leaving ports filled with goods that have been produced through coerced labor and entering markets where they are processed, sold, and consumed without the conditions of their origin being visible to those who benefit from them. This is where the connection tightens between suffering and wealth, because the products themselves become part of everyday life in distant places. Sugar in diets, cotton in clothing, tobacco in trade, each one carrying with it the hidden cost of the system that produced it. And as production increases, so does the flow of money, moving through merchants, ship owners, insurers, and financiers who begin to build entire industries around the reliability of this output. And that reliability is the key, because the system has now reached a point where it can sustain itself, supply itself, and produce consistently enough to support something larger than the plantations themselves. It begins feeding into a global network where goods, capital, and power move together, setting the stage for the next transformation, where the wealth generated here no longer stays local but starts to build something far more expansive. And once that flow of goods stabilizes, the system expands beyond the plantations themselves and begins to reshape the world that surrounds it, because what is being produced is no longer just raw material but momentum. A constant stream of commodities moving across oceans into markets that are growing faster than ever before. And this is where the scale shifts from regional to global, where the labor extracted in one place begins to power transformation in another, linking continents into a single economic circuit that feeds on itself. Sugar refined in Europe becomes a staple across societies. Cotton shipped from the American South feeds textile mills in Britain, where machines turn raw fiber into finished cloth at speeds never seen before. And those mills do not operate in isolation. They depend on steady input, predictable supply, and the continuation of the system that produces it, which means the plantations are no longer just agricultural sites. They are part of an industrial chain stretching across oceans, connecting fields, factories, ports, and markets into one continuous process. Trade routes intensify. Ships move in constant cycles, carrying goods one way and capital the other, and entire port cities begin to grow around this movement, their wealth tied directly to the reliability of the system that supplies them, while financial institutions evolve alongside it, offering credit, insurance, and investment structures that treat plantation output as stable enough to support expansion. And that is the shift that matters, because once the system reaches this level, it no longer feels like a collection of activities. It becomes infrastructure, embedded into economies, normalized through repetition, and protected because so many parts of the world now depend on its continuation. What began with contact on the African coast has now become a network that connects Africa, the Americas, and Europe into a triangular flow of people, goods, and capital, each reinforcing the other, each making the system harder to dismantle. And as that network strengthens, it begins to produce something even more powerful than trade. It begins to produce the kind of wealth that can reshape nations themselves. And when that wealth accumulates at scale, it does not sit still. It converts into power, because money flowing through ports and markets begins to reshape governments, expand influence, and build the physical and political structures of empire. And this is where the system reveals its final form, because what started as extraction now becomes dominance, with European powers using the profits generated from this network to fund navies, secure trade routes, and expand their reach across the globe. Ports grow into centers of finance and control. Shipyards expand to support fleets that protect and extend commercial interests. And trade companies evolve into powerful entities capable of influencing policy, negotiating treaties, and shaping the direction of entire regions, all backed by the steady flow of capital produced through plantation economies. Banks begin issuing credit against expected returns from slave-based production. Insurance companies calculate risk not just for ships, but for the people aboard them. And governments rely on the stability of these systems to maintain their own economic strength, creating a feedback loop where wealth reinforces power, and power protects the system that generates the wealth. This is no longer about individual plantations or isolated trades. It is about the rise of imperial structures that depend on this engine to sustain themselves, where expansion is financed by extraction and control is maintained through the same networks that began with human capture. And as these empires grow, their influence spreads into politics, law and global competition, shaping borders, economies, and hierarchies that extend far beyond the original system, embedding its logic into the foundations of the modern world. What makes this stage so critical is that the connection is not abstract, it is direct, because the ships, the fields, the markets, and the institutions are all part of the same chain, each reinforcing the other, each contributing to a system that transforms human suffering into imperial strength. And by the time this process reaches its peak, the structure is so deeply integrated that it becomes difficult to separate the rise of empire from the system that made it possible. And even when the system begins to fracture, when laws change and abolition movements gain ground, what it created does not disappear, because systems built over centuries do not simply vanish. They leave structure behind. And this is where the story turns from what was built to what remains, because the consequences do not end with the last ship or the final plantation. They continue in the world that system helped shape. Across Africa, the removal of millions of people over generations leaves demographic scars that alter societies in ways that cannot be easily reversed. While in Europe and the Americas, the wealth accumulated during that period continues to influence development, infrastructure, and economic power long after the original system is dismantled, creating imbalances that echo forward through time. The industries that grew from slave-produced commodities evolve into modern economies. The financial institutions that once depended on that trade adapt and expand, and the hierarchies that were constructed to justify the system, racial categories, legal distinctions, social divisions, do not disappear overnight. They are reworked, embedded into new systems, and carried into the future in different forms. What began as a way to organize labor becomes a framework that shapes identity, opportunity, and power across generations, affecting where wealth accumulates, where poverty persists, and how societies understand themselves and each other. And that is why the story does not end at abolition, because the chain that started with capture moved through transport, conversion, labor, and wealth, ultimately leaves behind a world structured by those processes, where the effects are still visible if you know where to look. And once you see it that way, it becomes harder to look at the modern world as something separate from that past, because the system didn't just end, it evolved, and the structures it built are still shaping economies, power, and inequality today. So the real question isn't just what happened back then, it's how much of it is still here now.